Thank you all for coming out and packing the house. Is everyone excited to hear about research tonight? Yeah. So tonight you're going to hear from Katya Hott, who leads the user research team at BrainPOP, a company that makes content and tools for teachers and students to use in their K-8 classrooms. Katya has a master's in digital media design for learning from NYU and experience working in EdTech and EdGames startups, as well as teaching ESL in Boston, where she was passionate about incorporating technology in her classroom. So please welcome Katya.
All right. Building a research repository that strengthens the research team. I am so excited that there's so much interest in this super niche topic. So before we get into it, can I ask who in the room does user research as part of your job? Okay. Who has embarked on building your own research repository, whatever that means to you? Okay. Who is considering doing that as something in the near future? Okay, cool. So super relevant. This is me looking very professional. As Kim said, I lead a team of user researchers at BrainPOP. It's education focused. Our users are school administrators, teachers, students, parents. We are a small team. There's 3 of us. We partner with a data research team with my colleague Kevin over here. And we do a lot of looking into problems, both at a high level and at a very granular classroom day-to-day level that students and teachers need to solve. So that's what I do at work. But here's this accurate picture of my brain when I'm at home. This is the upstairs of my house. This is my attic. I have children, clearly. This is kind of what I feel like often. And when I come to work, this is all swirling around in my brain, all these toys and mess and disarray. And so when someone asks me for a report that I may have done 3 years ago, I should mention I've been at my current position for 6 years, so I'm digging back. This is what I'm digging into, is this mess, and trying to remember that one toy. And so the questions I get at home feel a little bit like the questions I get at work. Here's the questions I get at home. Where is my Lego train? I need the wooden screwdriver for this construction kit right now. And then this really empowering feeling I get when only I can find the bendy Batman, because I know that he lives in a secret house, which is actually the pink bag that's inside the salad spinner, which I can no longer spin salad in because it's actually, oh my God, it's here. That's it, it lives up there. But whatever, bendy Batman is apparently not in this picture. These questions feel familiar to me at work because they sound a little bit more like this. Where is the report on new customer behavior? I need to know about how users feel about this cancel subscription flow right now. And then I have all the knowledge of where the reports live and which insights are in them. So digging through this mess of the toys in my attic is kind of what I feel like as a researcher at work, where I have all of this swirling around in my brain. So, okay, when do you need a research repository? When you're getting those questions. Do we have research on this thing? All this research just lives in my brain. I need to find the insights right now. These are sure signs that a repository is something that could benefit you. What is a research repository? So I took a stab at writing a definition. My definition is, a research repository is a place to store and access insights gathered from user research. Sounds pretty straightforward. But I'm also a member of this really awesome global community of researchers called Research Ops Community. We have a Slack group. Has anyone heard of Research Ops Community, part of it? Awesome. Yay, it's so great. And Research Ops Community is currently researching the creation of research repositories, because of course we would do something so meta. And there's a definition that the Research Ops Community has come up with, which is this. A research repository is any platform, system, drive, database, content collaboration tool, library, knowledge base, wiki, or file cabinet that stores research, data, notes, transcripts, images, videos, recordings, files, insights, reports, metadata, etc., to support consumption and reuse by the entire team. This is big. This is really big. I'm just going to go back to mine. This is really small. A place to store and access insights gathered from user research. So this big, giant definition, I'm focusing on this one narrow part, insights. Where do you store insights in a repository? There's a bunch of places. You may have heard of Polaris. It's WeWork's proprietary tool. A bunch of big organizations have one. Facebook has one. They're software that a company develops specifically for this purpose. Then there's software that you can buy to do something like this. Here's an example of one called the Dovetail app. There are many. And then there's a lot of people out there who are repurposing other tools like Airtable. This is a master research list of mine, or Confluence, or Google Docs, any of these spreadsheets, Excel, whatever, to make your own research repository. So why do this in the first place? There's a main dialogue around research repositories and why they're important and what they can help you with. And so when I started building a research repository, this was the main interesting thing that everyone wanted to do, democratize data. And what this means is you make your insights accessible for other people in your organization who are not researchers so they can go in and make their own meaning from insights. So this was like my goal. And the other big one was this, don't repeat research. Going back to that question, do you have a report on blah, blah, blah? You can say, yes, I do, doodle-doo, here it is in my repository, and here it is for you, and I don't have to repeat research, and I just saved everybody a lot of time. So these were the big benefits that I went in with, thinking we're going to build a repository, and this is what we're going to get out of it. So we started on our journey, those 3 user researchers at BrainPOP, figuring out how to build a repository. And we started by examining our spreadsheets. We have these spreadsheets. They look a little bit like this. You'll have a research question or some research goal at the top. I've made one up for you that's similar to the ones that I try to tackle, like what information do school admins need when they evaluate teacher performance? Okay, so we have some insights that we've collected through whatever methodology we used. Here's an example. School admins need to see student homework grades over time. Can have some tags on these things and a lot of different categories. This can go on and on and on. And another insight we may have collected through these interviews, let's say, is admins are constantly manually adjusting teacher grade books. Well, this first one about school admins need to see homework, this can answer that question. But the second one isn't really relevant to that question, but it's still really interesting. It's something that admins need to do, or they're struggling with, or they're concerned about. So what do we do with this green insight that we're not going to put in our report? Where does it go? Where it just kind of dies in the abyss of Google Docs. So we didn't want that to happen. So we reviewed our spreadsheets, and we tried to put them into a bunch of tools. EnjoyHQ is a great repository tool, Aurelius, Dovetail, there's many, many, many of these. And we kind of went deep into, I think, 5 of them, and we found something that didn't work with each one for us. Our needs were just so specific and they felt so unique to us that one of them didn't have a search feature that we could really use to search across all of our taxonomy. One of them, it just felt like everything was in a card, like a Trello board, and we just needed rows and rows and rows because we have so many insights. Like it just wasn't working. So we went back to the drawing board, we scrapped all those tools, we went back to our spreadsheets. We keep them in Airtable. We use Airtable to code our data, and we were trying to figure out a way to globally search across our Airtable bases, and there was no way to do it. So we went to our friends, our partners, the data research team, and we decided to make a table in our data warehouse, in our own data warehouse, where we put user data, raw quotes, tags, our insights, just where we would keep our other data in a data warehouse. And putting it in there means that we can pull it out into a data analytics platform like Looker, which is what we use at our company, where we can view a dashboard. So this beautiful thing is what my repository looks like. It may not be colorful or pretty or well designed, it's just a Looker dashboard, but it's super, super useful. So we can take up at the top there where you see filters, those are the columns, and we can just search in them and pull up a list of insights. This is an example of one, but this could go down depending on how many are in there. And right now what we've been doing is going back we went back about 2 years, reviewed all of those Airtables and spreadsheets and Trello boards from research, from raw data from those past 2 years, found the ones that felt like they would be evergreen enough to put into this thing, cleaned them up, coded them, uploaded them into here, into the database, and then pulled them into Looker so we can search. Sounds like a lot, but it actually was like incredibly satisfying to go through and clean data like that, and now have a place where if someone says, do you have research on? I can be like, I think I know a keyword to search for in my repository, and I'll pull up 25 insights across 7 different interviews from the last year that maybe I can put together a fresh new look for you. Okay, so what did we learn when we did this? Well, we learned that these were not the benefits that we got out of it. Democratizing data. Really, just the 3 of us user researchers were looking at this thing, right? Like, look at it. Hold on, I'm going to go back. Look at it. Nobody wants to look at that. Just us. We were looking at this, and we were the ones who knew what to search for. And we wanted to pull up old research, so we didn't have to do it again. But like, are your questions really ever exactly the same as they were a year ago or 2 years ago? We found that we were reconsidering research, not reusing it. So what are the benefits of a research repository? Comparing current work to past work. What this means is you can do something like this. Here's a kind of a messy, Airtable-y thing of primary raw data and the insights that I've created out of it, tagged with my own little system, and then pulling in a few from the repository. Here's just 2 with an R for repo. That means that these things that I collected in the past is relevant also to the questions that I'm trying to answer now, so I can tag all of this together and make new meaning from it. We also, through this process, really got to know our data. In creating a taxonomy to put into that database, we ended up examining our data and thinking, okay, we really need 22 columns in our taxonomy to do this. And we made all kinds of very granular columns and went through tons and tons of old research and coded all of them. And then in the end, when we're now searching through this thing, we found that we're only using the ones in red. And so what does that mean? Like, there's actually some really surprising ones here. Emotional state. We were not coding all of our granular insights, our nuggets, if you will, by emotional state before. But now, because it's part of our repo taxonomy, we keep it in mind as we're coding our data. We're like, oh, we better tag it with emotional state. We use a numerical scale for it, because we realized before we were tagging things like frustration or confusion or elation or whatever, and we're just like, okay, it's too many adjectives. Let's put them on 1 to 5. 1 is negative, 5 is positive, and so if something is a 4, it's pretty positive, 2, it's kind of negative, and a 3 is true neutral. It doesn't mean everything is tagged with a 3. It means anything that has kind of a neutral emotion is tagged with a 3. So we started thinking about, for every insight, what's the emotion behind it? And that's become really meaningful to us. And we can now search our repository. Let's say a question is like, how do teachers plan their lessons? We can search for lesson plan and negative emotion, number 1, see what's coming up. That's something that we wouldn't have done before. But some other tags, like the customer journey, are they a new customer? Are they a churning customer? We found that we just weren't able to tag it that way so much because we weren't always talking to customers. It just didn't really make sense for us, so we threw it out. We got to know our data better. And we're also now able to dig deep really quickly. Researchers, our little team, can go into our repository and get really deep in there in a matter of hours instead of doing primary research over days and then coding for a while and transcribing interviews. We look at our dashboard, a couple of hours later, we can come up with a report that feels pretty solid and is evidence-based. So, my theory is that creating the repository has made us better researchers. We're better for a few reasons. We have identified the nature of the data we collect. By making that taxonomy and figuring out which categories really apply and which ones don't apply, now we have a better sense of the data that we collect in general. So when someone asks us a question, we can think, we know we're probably going to collect this type of data, and we can make a guess at the type of answers that we'll come up with. It just has focused us. We know what we're working with. We also, like the emotional state example I gave, are able to create new meaning with the insights that we're collecting. So because we're using these new tags, we're able to see new patterns that we wouldn't have before because of the repository, because we coded for the repository. And like I said, we're not reusing our old stuff, we're reconsidering it. Our company has changed, our initiatives are different. Is the old stuff relevant to today? So we're reconsidering our old work, and it's making us think a lot deeper about what is relevant to our company. What are the goals of our initiatives? And so we've gotten better as researchers with understanding our company goals. And then finally, we've examined how we surface insights in our work. Because the repository is so insight-focused, we've been working with these granular bite-sized insights, and now in the reports that we're writing, those are the things that we're surfacing. As opposed to saying, hey, here's the research question, and here's how we answered it, and here are some answers, and here's some emergent findings. We're saying, here's the insights, and here's a little bit about them. And in the appendix, you could read about the research questions and the methodology. We're insights forward in a way that we weren't before. This doesn't come without its challenges. The first challenge I found is that institutional knowledge is golden. So when someone is saying, hey, do we have a report on, or can you find that Lego train, even when all the toys are totally organized and they're coded and categorized, it still takes someone who's kind of been in it to know, let me look in this category first. Somebody off the street isn't going to be able to come into my repository and know what to search for, no matter how clear the question is, no matter how clear the tags are. So still, institutional knowledge is important. Uploading insights is effort. So that journey that I walked you through of how we get our raw data from interviews or from whatever methodology we're using, and then code it, and then format it, and then upload it, and then pull it into our viewer, it takes time. So for example, let's say we've done a series of interviews and we have 100 insights from them, and we've coded them and analyzed them as part of that project. Then for me to take that and make sure that all of the categories are correct and in the right order and whatever, it's about an hour of kind of grooming and combing, and then pressing upload into the data warehouse and being like, please, 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 and not seeing any errors. Like that's an hour of my day when I could be doing something else. And it's not a fun hour, I'm not gonna lie. But it feels really rewarding when it's in there. It's still a challenge. And then finally, we need to be careful not to eat our own tail. So if we take insights from the repository and we mix them with new insights and we make new meaning, and then we upload all of that back into the repository, well, then we had insights that we pulled out, and now we put them back in, and now they're duplicated, and they have different tags on them, and it gets really messy really quickly. So having some sort of coding system to say, remember my R, those came from the repository, those always get filtered out before things go back in. Which means that maybe I made some new tags for that repository data that could be better than the stuff that's in there. I don't have a good system for that yet. Figuring out how to update. Garden, that's what they like to call it in the research repository world. Gardening your data, still a challenge. So to recap, here's what we thought. We were setting out to democratize data and not repeat our research. Where we landed, comparing current work better to past work, getting to know our data better, and digging deep quickly. And why we're better researchers, because now we have identified the nature of the data we collect. We're able to uncover new meaning, we have a better sense of what's relevant to our company's needs, and we're insights forward. This is why I believe we're truly better researchers after this basically year-long process of figuring out how to spin up a repo. So here's my attic toy repository. Everything in its place. There's a place for the baby toys, there's a place for the kid toys, there's exercise equipment, there's blocks. And because it looks like this, I'm able to know where things are, figure out how they're coded so that I can pull them out, or that someone else can pull them out, and maybe find all the insights that have wheels, and line them up, and figure out what colors they are and how long they are, and make new meaning out of it. And look how happy we are when we do that. Huge shout out to the Research Ops community, where I've learned way more about research insight repositories than I ever thought I would in my lifetime. And I hope that you all stay in touch.
Thank you.
Hi, I am a UX designer, fortunate enough to work with a user researcher who's part of a small but larger research team. So we have research that we work with. However, I've noticed that the formats it gets produced in is not always the same type of spreadsheet, and sometimes it's not a spreadsheet, sometimes it's like a page in a wiki or something. So what advice would you have for someone who's like got a lot of research and would love to make something like this, but the format and therefore the metadata is kind of all over the place?
The main advice would be do not underestimate the time it takes to clean this stuff up. The first exercise that we did, because we had a very similar situation, was go through and very quickly say, this is repository worthy, this is not. This is repository worthy, this is not. And then we landed with a set of reports over the last couple years that were like, this stuff should go into a repository. And then, to be totally honest, I hired an intern. And I was like, can you go through all of this stuff and tag it? And it took her an entire summer, really, to go through the amount of research that we put in our repository. And I also worked with her and went back and cleaned up a lot of the stuff because I have the institutional knowledge. Learned very quickly that that was important. But I would say don't underestimate how much work it is to clean up old research to get it into a format like this, but also don't underestimate the value that comes out of it. And if you need to make a case to somebody, you can give that example of, hey, if you have a question on what research we have, right now it takes me weeks, but it would literally take me hours to answer that if you let me have an intern this summer to do this for me.
Yes, hello. I have a little question about the ever-changing app ecosystem that we are researching for in my company. If user research is being done on a version that's 2 or 3 versions behind the version that we're actually using now, how do you organize deprecated kind of research? How do you have timestamps? So that's the question.
Yeah, we do have timestamps. So every insight that goes into the repository, we have a date on it for when it was collected, or at least when it was put into a spreadsheet, so some rough date. And we also, like I said, we select the research that goes in there that feels like it's going to be the most evergreen. And there's a couple ways to do that. One is to start by selecting strategic or exploratory research as opposed to tactical research. A usability test about a button, it's probably not going to be evergreen because you're about to change that button, and you don't need that in your repository. But if you're doing a usability test and you spend the first few minutes of the usability test getting to know the person and asking them about what they do in their day-to-day, that stuff's gold, and that goes in the repository. So dividing it by type. And then after that, once you have, okay, here's my strategic research or my interviews that I feel like are going to be true for a long time, then you can go back to those and identify the ones where, okay, this customer base is something, like this is a person that we're probably still going to cater to a few years down the road. Like thinking about that relevancy piece, what's relevant to my company, and just flagging those and then putting them in. The act of going back and cleaning them up, I've found, for me at least, has to happen in the moment. When I do a query and I pull up a bunch of insights and I'm like, oh, that one is like really not a thing anymore, then I have to go and remove it or change it. But I haven't done like everyone stop and we're all gonna go in the repository and garden. That seems, I'm not a gardener really.
Hi, how do you define insights versus findings versus a report? Like I know we use these words as researchers so generally, but I don't know if you define it differently than what it might be used in other organizations.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, so an insight is the smallest bit of learning that is still meaningful. If you broke it down any smaller, it would not be meaningful anymore. I think of it as akin to like a morpheme in linguistics, or like the smallest bit of sound that has a meaning in a language. And if you, like cat, but if I say k, it no longer has a meaning. Like that's an insight. So if you can take one sentence that has some meaning, like I research with teachers a lot. So like teachers need to prep before their lesson for at least 20 minutes, whatever, I'm making something up. Like if you take any part of that sentence out and it's lost its meaning, to me that's an insight. Findings and insights can be interchangeable if you're doing like an insight forward share, which is what we try to do now, where it's like, okay, we collected 100 insights across all these interviews, and some of them may be very related, so we can lump those together and pull a finding out of that. That finding may be exactly the same as an insight, or it may be something a little larger, but what goes into the repository itself are those granular insights. Does that kind of get at it? I think finding is really nebulous to me. Insight is not. Insight is that smallest piece of meaning that you could make. We're going to take one back here.
Hi, sorry.
Hello.
I was hiding. So I'm a researcher of one at a small tech company, and we're working on building a repository with Dovetail. So my biggest question is, what advice do you have for creating a tagging and coding system? And then do you also include quantitative data, or are you focused on qualitative user data?
Yeah. So creating the tagging system, we had maybe like 3 false starts. And we started, remember I showed 22 columns? We started with like way more. Like we were like, let's just tag as many tags as we could possibly ever need on any of this stuff. And then, so we made our taxonomy just brainstormed. Let's think of all the tags, and then we pressure tested it with one research study that we knew would go into the repository and tried to tag all of the insights with those things. And we found that scrolling through that, it was a spreadsheet with tags, and we were like, wow, this column is just empty all the way down. Why? Does it mean that that tag isn't applicable to this study, or it's just not a good tag? So we pressure tested it with a bunch of stuff, and then we uploaded it into the repository. And a little while later, after we uploaded a few studies, I deleted the entire repository, and we did it again. Because there was too many tags, and they weren't the right tags. So it took a little while of figuring it out, but that was the process. Brainstorm tags, pressure test it against a couple reports, upload them, see if you can mix and match between different studies and make meaning, and if it's working, keep going. I think Dovetail may be pretty flexible with that. It's going to be more flexible than something in a data warehouse like we have. But you then be even more careful, right? Because we have a pretty strict structure now where adding a column isn't so easy, but adding a tag in Dovetail is really easy. So you could get to the point where you've made your taxonomy, and then you're just willy-nilly adding more tags as you find them relevant, and that will get messy, because then you'd have to go back to your old insights, make sure they're tagged if you want them to be part of a search that you're doing with that tag. So you had another question, and I forgot it.
It was about if you add quantitative.
Oh, quantitative
data.
Yeah. So quantitative data that comes out of the data research team, there's granular insights there too, and they are not in the repository because I haven't gotten there. I think they should be, and that's something that Kevin and I can talk about later. But quantitative data, so what we did try to put was survey data into the repository. And so when you have an open-ended text field, a lot of those things can become insights, and that can go into the repository. And then you have raw data from what the user actually wrote. That lives in the repository. But we were doing some weird thing where we were like, okay, we also have insights, we wrote a survey and we found that 50% of people do blah, blah, blah. And that 50% of people statement was an insight in the repository, and those ended up feeling really off base. The tags didn't match up to those because it wasn't a single user, and we didn't know what to put in raw data, and we ended up, that was one of the reasons why I killed the whole thing and started over. We took out that survey data. So is that the best way to do it? I'm not sure, but that's what worked for us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions?
There's here.
Take one on the other side of the room.
Hi. Can you just speak a little bit about the process of doing it in Looker? That's something that we use at my company, but it's not something I've worked with. What kind of knowledge is necessary to put it into Looker?
You have to befriend a data engineer. Step 1. Mine's name is Steve. He's my friend and buddy and helped me out with setting this stuff up. I am not a SQL whiz by any means, but my rudimentary knowledge of SQL was enough. Once we built the table in the data warehouse, then I was able to write queries before we pulled anything into Looker. And so I could just say, okay, I'm going to try to search for whatever keyword in this column in this table and see what I find and see if that's working. So we didn't even pull anything into Looker until pretty recently, until a couple months ago. Before that, it just felt premature because Looker feels like that's the repository. You can just click on the link and go there, and because it's a table in our warehouse, we could pull it into Looker like any other dashboard. But I feel like the necessary requirements to get there were to partner with someone to set it up, because I'm not a data engineer, and then to know enough people to pressure test what's in there so that you can write your own queries without accidentally like dropping an entire table or doing something terrible for your company. And it's not a lot of SQL that I needed to know to do that, to be fairly safe and also be able to pressure test what I'm searching for. So yeah, get help.
Hi, we developed the accounting and compliances product, and then we do a lot of client interviews.
Yeah.
Regulation changes, so the client pain point has changes every year.
Yeah.
So how do you, when you say you have current work and old work in the tagging, how do you measure the old pain points, like shift to the new pain points in your user interviews?
Yeah, in the repository, right. Not in the interviews. Yeah, so that's where the storing the date is really handy, and that's where the institutional knowledge is handy. Because if a user's pain point has shifted because regulations have shifted, then it doesn't mean that everything about those insights is now totally moot. Like those things are probably still important, especially if an insight is around a pain point that's in a greater context. That context still might be real and interesting. So that's where we try to, we have a similar issue, right? Because we work in education and there's like education standards that are released, like things change in the industry. And having institutional knowledge of that is really helpful. So you can say, I know in 2018 that was not the case. I would suggest, this is on my to-do list, but like in a handbook for your team, having some sort of truth, right? That here's what we should know about our industry. This regulation happened in this year. This standard was introduced in this year, whatever. Anyone who's a future researcher coming in should know these things so that you can make use of that date that's tagged on all of your insights. I wouldn't go in and delete things that feel not relevant for a reason like that. That's different than data gardening. You're not saying, oh, this usability thing is no longer an issue because we deleted that button. That's something about the outside world. That's about institution. So I'd keep those insights. They still feel important. But I would make sure that there's some documentation that says, hey, there was a big change in our industry. We should know that so we can filter by date.
Hi, I have a couple of questions, 2 questions. And I think one relates to some of the questions that were previously asked, and maybe the question that you just asked. And I'm not sure if I'm getting the answer. The question that I have is kind of like in the phase of gathering the insights and then inputting into the database. Mm-hmm. How do you structure the data on a high level? Like if you're comparing from last year to this year, are you comparing features or another type of dimension? Because I know that the tagging is something that gets distilled out of that data.
Yeah. So that's part of the taxonomy. One of the things that we've kept is we have a column for feature, like what feature the users are even talking about, because often that's part of it, even if the insight is something that's grander or it's about their life or their way of doing something, usually a feature is brought up. So we've kept features so that we can compare. I actually did a query in my repository today about a feature that was exactly that. There was only 4 insights about it, which I was sad about. But it's got us somewhere. So I would say that that's part of a taxonomy. That helps you compare. But that like high level, I think what you're asking, if I understand correctly, is when you're inputting insights into your repository and you know you're going to be comparing them to past work, what is the comparison point between something that's a little less focused than a feature, like attitude shift or like job change or process change, that kind of thing?
It was kind of the other way around. I think like a kind of on a higher level grouping, I would have thought that it's either a feature or some type of goal or some type of action that...
Okay, so we have a bucket. It's the messiest one. It's called theme. Everyone laughs. I love this. You're all researchers. Yeah, the theme bucket. This is the messiest answer that I can give to this, but it still works. Okay, let me tell you about the theme bucket. How I use it in the repository is it's the catch-all. If something doesn't fit into the other tags that we've created, then it goes in the theme bucket. And often when we're tagging raw data from a research study, what happens is we've invented tags for that specific study. So if I'm researching something about student behavior and I know that it's in the classroom and I know that students do 3 things in the classroom, they do group work and independent work and they do homework, then I have those 3 tags for that specific study. Those tags don't fit into my taxonomy. What do I do with them? I put them in the theme bucket. Is it a great solution? No. Does it come up in the queries? Oh yeah, all the time. Do I query theme the most? Yes. So, yeah.
Hi, I know it's clear, right? You're using the repository for queries and questions that are coming in that you or others may have. Are there other ways you found to use the repository, like say for recruiting or persona or journey mapping type of work?
Yeah.
How does that fit?
Personas, yes. Journey mapping, no. And we tried both. So we have personas, and they have made an appearance in our tagging structure. And they have also, another one like the emotional state, which I feel like has made us better researchers. As we're doing our research and coding our insights, we are making sure that we understand what is the persona of the user that's saying these things, and now that's in the repository. So we can be like, hey, anyone who's in this persona bucket who's talking about this and who has this negative emotion, let's pull it up. So personas, yes, that's really related. Journey mapping, no. The journey that we started thinking would be really important, which I mentioned before, was the customer journey in terms of coming into our product and leaving the product, kind of like the hiring and firing jobs to be done journey. And we just found that but we didn't always know what the journey state was, especially when we're looking at past research. We weren't filling it in very often, and when we were filling it in, it wasn't very meaningful. That may be different in a different industry where your journey looks different. But yeah, I think the answer to a lot of these questions is about tags, right? Maybe that's not what I anticipated, but yeah, our persona tag is what enables us to do that.
And what about recruiting? Like, do you go back to the same people?
We don't use the repository for that. Okay. We have another spreadsheet. It's an Airtable, and we mark when we've talked to somebody on different things so that we know not to overuse someone so they don't become an expert and blah, blah, blah. That's a separate thing.
Hi, Lara. Nice to meet you. I found about this talk in the Research Ops Slack community, so very excited. I actually have a question about staffing, because you're the manager of your team, right? Mm-hmm. So this research repository maintenance work, or even fielding requests from people across the company about what research do we have about this, is a lot of time, right? And so I was wondering, how do you staff your team against things like maintenance of the repository, or building the repository, or using the repository to field and answer questions versus doing new research, or staffing new research? Because when thinking about building a repository, that's one of the things I always think of is, what is the ROI of building this tool and the, in my case, woman hours I have to staff that tool versus building new research projects or doing new research projects, which might be more timely and useful insights for my stakeholders in the moment.
Sure. So we don't have the luxury of having a large team where we could just put out a research ops role and hire somebody to do this and specialize in that. But that's what the bigger companies are doing right now. This is a thing. It's a thing now. Research ops is a thing, and you could be hired just to be the repository person. I did hire that intern. That was helpful. But we work really carefully in figuring out our division of research craft and research ops. And we've used the research ops community operations map that Kate Towsey kind of initiated, which I recommend everybody check out, to figure out which research ops were relevant to our work, which we were doing a good job at, which we were doing poorly, and which we were not doing but should be doing. And then we divided, there's 3 of us, we divided that work by interest. And it was really clear that other members of my team were more interested in doing things like scaling research to designers, and I was really into the repository. So I took that one, but it was not like this kind of haphazard, like we made it was actually, we use OKRs at our company, and it was an objective that we worked around, that we were going to figure out who does what ops, and we were going to meet results on those ops. And having it be an objective and writing it with key results that were measurable makes it a lot easier to prove ROI on something like this. I don't think we were calling it ROI at that point, but I was saying, I actually had a presentation to the main stakeholders at the company where the last couple slides, I literally said the words, imagine a world, and then I had a few slides. Imagine a world where you had a question about this segment and I could answer it in minutes. Imagine a world, like I sold it like that. And so we say no to some research requests because we don't have the bandwidth. And part of the reason we don't have the bandwidth is because we do research ops. But it's now being, Kevin can tell you, it's now being recognized at the point where if someone's like, hey, do you have any information on how these family subscribers do whatever? And we're like, we will write you a one-pager today. Because yes. And people are like, oh, cool, that's really fast. How? We have a repository. That's what we spent all summer doing. It's become we sold it, they allowed us to do it, and now the return on investment is clear. Yeah. There's 1, 2.
First of all, thank you for speaking to us about this. Do you think that trying to democratize the data expands the scope to be too ambitious, or that there are still ways to do it? And I was also curious about the emotional state tagging. Is that just assigned, and have you run into any challenges with that, or is it usually pretty accurate for your purposes?
Okay, democratizing data. I kind of didn't want to get into it, but I'll say my piece. I feel like this is the controversial. This is my hot take on democratizing data. I don't like it. I don't think it's good. I think if you're working really closely with designers and they understand your users and your partners, great, they should be in the repository. But if you have stakeholders who are going to go in there and just be like, here is the one insight that proves or disproves my point, I don't want them in my thing. So, thank you, my people. I did come into it with this open mind of democratizing data. That was in when I started the repository, and I think it's out. I don't think it's a good practice. I don't think researchers should be the only ones to have the keys to the insights castle, right? Other people need to be allowed in. And if you don't have a large research team, we're a centralized team, we don't have a researcher sitting on each one of our product squads. You don't have the bandwidth to be hand-holding everybody in there. But if you do your repository well, you can field questions quick enough that you can either say, hey, I didn't have time to code this data, but I just sent you a spreadsheet with a bunch of insights, and you can go through and look at these, whatever. I can kind of scaffold in a way where I couldn't before. And so I don't think it's just that we didn't have the time to do it. It's that we found that we didn't want to do that. The emotional state thing, yeah, it's subjective, especially if you're going back to data from way back and you're reading the raw quote and you're like, oh, I don't really have time today to go listen to that audio file and really try to feel the emotion of that user. But that's where institutional knowledge comes back in, because I've been at the company for 6 years, so there's a good chance that I did hear that interview, or I was the interviewer, and I can go back and be like, hey, I remember that this was actually a really frustrating thing, and I can tag it as such. But you don't need to have that institutional knowledge for all of the raw data. Sometimes just reading it, you get a good sense. And if it doesn't have an emotion tag on it, we don't tag it. A 3 isn't everything. A 3 is neutral. When someone says I'm fine with that, that's a 3. If someone says, hi, my name is Stacy and I'm the principal at Oak Elementary, that's not a 3, that's a nothing. So it is subjective, but I don't feel like it's risky.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. Could you talk a bit more about the challenge of combining or incorporating quantitative data into the repository? Because I think it can be super valuable if you have qual and quant kind of pointing at the same insight.
Yeah. So I want to make sure, because sometimes people say quantitative data and they mean survey data. Are you talking about survey data, or are you talking about like behavioral analytics or other types of? Like,
both of it. Both
Okay.
of it. So we're trying to do one repository, hopefully having all of it in there.
Okay, cool. I think the challenge for me is the taxonomy for that. So if you have, like I said before, if you have survey data, like 50% of people do blah, 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 then your tags may not line up if you're also using those same tags for a single raw quote with an insight that is drawn from that raw quote. I feel like, I don't know if I could have combined those things in a repository in a neat way. And it was starting to feel messy. Like we were querying things and we'd pull a report and there'd be a bunch of raw quotes and then there'd be this like random like factoid, 50% of people, which is an insight, that is a granular insight, but it just didn't match up with everything else. And we were not sure how to incorporate that information in with what we were getting. Where I do think, I mean, maybe it's a separate repository. That sounds really scary. But I do think that there's, like, you can have an equivalent to your qualitative insights that you find in your quantitative data. And that may be like a pattern that you see in only this segment. And you can say, like, this is the insight from that. This segment does X, Y, and Z. And have a tagging system that works there that may also work with the user data. I just didn't find that. Doesn't mean we don't do mixed methods. We actually, at our company, have an insights department, and we have both of our teams sitting under there, and we share an office. Like, we work together. And every single research request that comes into our team, we have someone from both qual and quant represented in the consultation that we do with the person who requested to make sure that we can do mixed methods methodologies if necessary. Like, even if we don't think it's really a thing, we do it anyway. So we do it in practice, but in the repository, I haven't found how it jives.
Can you say quant survey research?
No, in that case, data science, yeah.
Any others?
So we're kind of a small company with like 100 people, and so it's not like people are coming us with research questions. We're more saying, oh, we're working on a product feature or design or whatever, we should research for that, and we're pushing it towards them. But in that, we've been needing to start a repository, and we've started just with Airtable, having all in one base.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, because we're small now, and so I don't think we'd ever get engineering support to get our content into a data warehouse, which we wouldn't be able to do on our own. At what point do you think it's okay for one to stay in kind of a smaller tool up to a certain point, and then at what point is it like recommended to switch over to something more manageable, I guess, for a lot more data? And then second, is it easy to migrate from Airtable to another system, from your experience?
Yeah, I love Airtable. I love it. So like the answer is like, yes, do Airtable forever. Airtable does have some flaws. It doesn't have history. If you make a mistake, like a really bad mistake, you can't just go back to a version. Yeah, we ran into that last week, actually. So there's 3 of us, right? 2 of us love Airtable. 1 of us hates Airtable. It's not for everybody, and she actually keeps a list of things she hates about it and then sends it to them. Like, it's like a deep thing. So I would say, yeah, if you are collecting insights and you can work with them in one spreadsheet that just goes all the way down, or one, what does Airtable call it? Table. Yeah, right. And then you can use a search block to search across your different tables. That's good. Do that as long as you can. When you start loading that thing and it's spinning, then you got to move into something that's a little more powerful. And in our case, that was the data warehouse.
How big was your like how many rows would you get?
Well, okay, so we tried Airtable at first, but all of our analysis were in different bases. So we were copy and pasting things into, because you can't like look up from another base. So we're copying and pasting Airtables into the master. So really what we ended up with was scrapping that entire thing because it was too much work. We never got to the point where it was I'm going really fast. And, oh my God. Here and here, we ended up doing this instead. This fits the definition of a repository. If you remember that big definition from the Research Ops community, this is just a list of reports. But look, we have the report, we have the year, we have the quarter, we have the methodology, we have the link to it. If there is a second report, we have a link to that, and the number of participants, and who owned it. Like, we have tagged all of this stuff too. So we use Airtable as a different type of repository. It's a report list, but we refer to this all the time as well. So I would say build it in Airtable. If that's an easy place for you to upload, like you can have a form that you just enter stuff and it goes into Airtable, like that's great. I don't know how many insights. Is it 5,000 and then it starts spinning? I don't know. But you'll get to a point where it feels unwieldy.
We can take maybe one or two more questions. There are others.
Sorry, that was my second question.
Oh, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about the next phase of the repository? Is it going to be in Looker? Have you looked at other products that potentially can bring the same kind of level of sophistication that you need?
Yeah, I think the next phase of the repository is creating a more robust program for getting insights in there. Right now, our program for getting insights into the repository is me. I comb the research after it's done, and I make sure that it's formatted, and I upload it. And it's not a ton of time, but it's not that's not a program, that's a person. And so I think that setting this up as an actual program, an operations program, so whether that's better documentation, like I have a how to put insights into the repository, and I just reference it myself. Like that's not, maybe it's better documentation, maybe it's getting a couple other people on board, maybe it's doing a better job, this is what I really want, a better job of when we're tagging our insights initially, like the raw data that we just collected, that it'll be pre-formatted so that nobody's doing that kind of cleanup. I think that's the next step. I don't foresee coming out of the database and going into a different tool anytime soon. But I do know that all these tools, the 3 I listed here, and the many more are evolving rapidly, and I keep seeing more and more of them coming. So my guess is that pretty soon, one of these is going to check all the boxes, and then we will just do a dump. Download it all, upload it all, and then we'll have something that's a little like prettier to look at and easier to upload into. But our system's working right now. So, and also, there's a thing to be careful with about this stuff. It's third party, and you have user data. It's sensitive stuff. I work in education with kids. Like, I don't want to. We'd get in trouble. Like, we need to put this stuff in somewhere where it's safe. If you work in healthcare, if you work anywhere where your data is sensitive, you need to be really careful about even experimenting with these tools. So that's another thing to keep in mind.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Katya.
Thank
Let's
you.
give her another round of applause. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Thank you to our volunteers, Lisa, Michael, and Teresa. Stick around and meet somebody new, and have a great evening. We'll see you next month.